My son kicked me out and took the 3.2 nm because I refused to obey my daughter-in-law. I called 911. The sound of the front door locking behind me was colder than the wind on my face. My own son stood there, holding the keys, telling me I had no place in this house anymore. The house I had paid for, the one worth over $3.2 million, the one where I had cooked every holiday meal and tucked him in as a boy, was now in his hands because I had refused to follow his wife's rules. For years, I had kept my voice soft, believing peace in a family was worth any sacrifice, but that silence only taught them I could be pushed aside. The moment I saw the moving truck pull away with my things, something in me broke, and something else began to rise. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. Subscribe if you know what it feels like to be treated as a burden, even after carrying the weight of a family for a lifetime. The autumn air in Charleston had a way of wrapping around you like an old quilt. It carried the scent of dry leaves and the faint sweetness of pecans roasting somewhere down the street. From the bay window in my living room, I could see the maple trees along the sidewalk turning a deep, burnt orange, their branches arching overhead like a canopy. The light fell in soft, golden patches across the hardwood floors, the same floors I had polished for more than 40 years. My house was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet I had grown to appreciate since retiring from the library, and I thought I could finally rest in the peace I had earned. I was 75 and had been living alone for over a decade since Robert passed. People often told me I had aged gracefully, but it was not grace, not really. It was endurance. I had learned to take each day as it came, to fill it with small rituals that kept the loneliness at bay. Mornings with coffee in my favorite mug, afternoons tending to the roses along the front path, evenings in the library room surrounded by the scent of old books. My days were steady, predictable, and safe. Gregory, my only son, visited often, and at first, I believed it was out of love and concern. He would sit in the kitchen, sipping the tea I made, talking about his real estate ventures, his big plans, his challenges. I listened the way mothers do, nodding, encouraging, offering a steady place for his restless energy to land. When Vanessa began coming with him, I welcomed her too. She was polished in a way I had never been, with perfectly styled hair and an eye for every detail in the house. I told myself she was just taking an interest, that her remarks about replacing the curtains or moving the sofa were nothing more than suggestions. Looking back, I see the way her eyes lingered on certain parts of the house, the way her voice carried a note of quiet authority that Gregory never questioned. She was kind enough on the surface, but there was something underneath, a precision in her words that made me feel as if I were being gently herded toward an invisible edge. Still, in those early days, I brushed it off. Families adjust, I told myself. They grow together in new ways. The first hint that something was shifting came one Saturday afternoon in late October. Gregory arrived carrying a box of pastries, and Vanessa followed with a large tote bag. While Gregory talked about a new development project he was struggling to finance, Vanessa began rearranging the framed photos on the mantel. She said they would look better grouped by size and color, but as she worked, I noticed she quietly removed several old pictures altogether, including one of Robert and me on our wedding day. I asked if she had set them somewhere safe, and she simply smiled and said she was helping to make the space less cluttered. It was such a small thing, but it lodged in my chest. Later that evening, after they left, I put the photos back where they belonged. The next time they visited, Vanessa didn't mention it, but her glance toward the mantel told me she had noticed. November crept in with shorter days and cooler nights. I began to notice that Gregory and Vanessa's visits were growing more purposeful. They arrived with notepads and conversations that seemed rehearsed. Gregory talked more about the value of the house, how it had appreciated over the years, how much money it could bring if I ever decided to downsize. I reminded him that this was my home, the one Robert and I had worked for, the place we built together. He would smile and say he understood, but the subject always came up again. One afternoon, Vanessa joined me in the kitchen while Gregory took a call outside. She leaned against the counter, her voice soft, and told me it was not safe for someone my age to live alone in such a big house. She spoke about stairs being dangerous, about how much easier life would be in a smaller place, perhaps a condo downtown. I stirred the soup on the stove and told her I appreciated her concern, but I liked my home as it was. She did not press the matter, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something unreadable, before she changed the subject. By Thanksgiving, the air was sharp with the promise of winter. The neighborhood was dressed in lights, and every window glowed in the early evenings. Gregory and Vanessa came for dinner, and I went to bed that night, thinking maybe I had imagined the tension. We laughed over the meal, shared stories, and it felt almost normal again. But the morning after, I found myself replaying little details. The way Vanessa walked slowly through each room before leaving, her hand grazing the banister as if testing its sturdiness. The way Gregory had looked at the study, lingering just long enough for me to wonder what he was thinking. They were not just visiting anymore. They were looking. I told myself to stop overthinking, that suspicion would only sour the holidays. And yet, there was a restlessness in the air that had not been there before. I had spent my life believing that love and trust were enough to hold a family together, that the roots we plant early will keep us steady when storms come. What I did not realize then was that storms often build in silence, their clouds forming far beyond the horizon until the day they are suddenly overhead. That autumn, I still believed I was safe. I still believed my home was mine, my life was my own, and that my children's loyalty was as steady as the tide. I had no idea how quickly the ground beneath me was about to shift. The smallest cracks had already begun to form, and I, too content in my quiet routines, had not yet seen how deep they would go. The first real shift came quietly, almost as if it had been planned that way. Gregory and Vanessa started dropping by on weekdays instead of the usual weekend visits. They would appear in the late afternoon, always with some reason to stop in. Sometimes it was to bring groceries they thought I might need. Other times it was because they had been in the neighborhood. I tried to see it as kindness, but there was a different tone to their presence, something that pressed into the rhythm of my days. On one of those afternoons, Vanessa walked through the front door with a breezy smile and a shopping bag dangling from her arm. Inside were new throw pillows in a muted beige. She told me they would give the living room a more modern feel, and before I could answer, she was pulling the old floral cushions from the sofa and setting the new ones in place. Gregory followed her in, carrying a stack of papers he wanted to review at the dining table. I sat in my armchair, watching them move around the house as if it belonged to all three of us. Vanessa adjusted the curtains, remarking that the heavy fabric blocked too much light, while Gregory spread his paperwork out like it was his personal office. None of it was outright rude, but it was as if the boundaries that had always been there were starting to fade. Over the next few weeks, the suggestions began to come more often. Vanessa would comment on how much space the dining set took up, or how the guest bedroom could be better used as a home office. Gregory hinted that I might enjoy living in a place where I did not have to worry about constant upkeep. Each time, I nodded politely, not wanting to spark an argument, but inside I felt the ground shifting under me. One Saturday, they arrived with a large box. Inside was a set of sleek white dishes to replace my mismatched collection, some of which had been with me since before Gregory was born. Vanessa unpacked them quickly, stacking the new plates neatly in the cupboard and setting the old ones aside in a cardboard box. She told me she would drop them off at the donation center on her way home. I felt a pinch in my chest as I watched the box disappear into the trunk of her car. It was not just the objects that were leaving the house. Bit by bit, the warmth of the home I had built was being replaced by their vision of what it should be. I began to notice that even Gregory, who had once relaxed in the old recliner and chatted about his day, now seemed to move through the rooms with a certain purpose. His eyes would linger on the high ceilings, the crown molding, the original hardwood floors. He spoke often about how rare houses like mine had become in Charleston, and how the market was hotter than ever. One afternoon, as I was reading in the library room, Vanessa came in holding a tablet. She showed me photos of high-end condos downtown, describing the views, the amenities, the ease of living without a yard to maintain. Her tone was warm, but there was an insistence in her words that made my shoulders tense. I told her I appreciated the information, but I was happy where I was. She smiled, closed the tablet, and said she understood. Yet I could feel her studying me, measuring how far she could push. December arrived, and with it came the early sunsets. The neighborhood glowed with holiday lights, but inside my home, the atmosphere felt different. Gregory stopped by one evening without Vanessa, which was unusual. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping the tea I had made, and talked about his business troubles. He told me he was trying to keep a project from falling apart, that the investors were getting impatient. His voice was calm, but I could hear the strain beneath it. I wanted to help, but there was a hesitation in me I could not name. Later that week, they came together, bringing a large potted plant as a gift. Vanessa placed it in the foyer, saying it brightened the space. As she adjusted the plant's position, Gregory walked through the house, glancing at each room as though taking inventory. When he joined us again, he casually mentioned that a friend of his, a real estate agent, had been asking about the neighborhood and the value of homes like mine. I laughed softly and said my house was not on the market. He smiled, but it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. By mid-December, even the smallest changes in my routine seemed to draw comment. Vanessa would remark on the way I stored the linens or how long I took to sort the mail. Gregory started offering to handle my bills for me, saying it would take the burden off my shoulders. I told him I was fine managing my own affairs, but the suggestion lingered in the air like a shadow. Christmas came and went in a blur. We shared a meal here at the house, but something in the rhythm of the day fell off. Vanessa moved through the kitchen like it was hers, rearranging items in the pantry and setting the table with her new dishes. Gregory spent most of the evening on his phone, stepping out for calls he did not explain. I tried to tell myself it was just the stress of the season, that once the new year began, things would settle. But the truth was already there, hidden in plain sight. My home was no longer simply mine. Each visit from Gregory and Vanessa seemed to plant another seed of change, small enough to overlook in the moment, but adding up over time. I could feel a pattern forming, though I could not yet see where it would lead. As the year turned, the air in the house felt heavier. I went about my days, keeping my routines, but I found myself listening to the sound of their car in the driveway, wondering what new suggestion or change would come next. The warmth of autumn had faded, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I still wanted to believe the best of them. I still wanted to think that everything they did came from care. But a part of me, the part that had weathered enough storms to recognize the early signs, was beginning to whisper that something was coming, something I would not be able to ignore. It was a cold January morning when I noticed the first thing that truly unsettled me. I had been keeping my heart medication in the same kitchen cabinet for years, tucked neatly beside the tea canisters. I reached for the bottle as I did every morning, but my hand landed on an empty space. I checked the counter, the table, even the small basket where I sometimes left grocery receipts, but the bottle was nowhere to be found. At first, I told myself I might have absent-mindedly moved it. The holidays had been busy, and perhaps I had shifted things around while cleaning. I searched the pantry, the bathroom cabinet, even the pockets of my cardigan, but nothing turned up. I made a mental note to call the pharmacy for a refill and went about my day, trying not to let the thought settle too heavily. Later that week, Gregory and Vanessa arrived unannounced. Gregory went straight to the living room, speaking loudly about some business call he needed to make, while Vanessa lingered in the kitchen. She opened cupboards without asking, making small comments about how cluttered certain shelves looked. When I mentioned that my medication had gone missing, she tilted her head and said she had noticed lately I seemed more forgetful. Her voice was light, but the words pressed down on me. She added that it was normal at my age, and perhaps it was time to have someone help me keep track of such things. Her comment stayed with me long after they left. I had always been careful with my health. Forgetfulness had never been part of me, not even in small ways. The idea that she would suggest it so easily, as if she had been waiting for the moment, felt heavier than I wanted to admit. The following week, I picked up a new prescription and kept it in the same cabinet as before. I told myself it was fine, that the first incident had been a fluke. Then, not 2 weeks later, I opened the cabinet one morning to find the bottle half empty. I had only taken a handful of pills. I stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of the math. The thought that someone else could have been in my kitchen, in my home, and taken them without saying a word, made my skin prickle. I began locking the front door even when I was home, something I had never felt the need to do before. Still, Gregory and Vanessa seemed to have a way of appearing inside without much warning. They had a key, of course, and though I considered asking for it back, I hesitated. It felt like a step I was not ready to take. One afternoon, Gregory came by alone. He sat at the table, leaned forward, and told me that Vanessa had been worried. He said they both felt it might be time for me to consider moving into a smaller place, or even an assisted living facility. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as if he had been preparing for this conversation. I told him I was fine where I was. He smiled faintly, but I caught the way his eyes scanned the kitchen, as if taking note of something. That evening, I found a pill from my prescription lying on the floor near the baseboard in the hallway. I could not imagine how it had gotten there. I had never been careless with my medication. I picked it up and sat at the kitchen table, rolling it between my fingers, a cold certainty settling in my chest. This was not about forgetfulness. The next time Vanessa visited, she brought along a pill organizer, one of those plastic cases with separate compartments for each day of the week. She said it would help keep things in order. I thanked her politely, but as she filled it from my bottle, I watched her hands carefully. She worked quickly, talking about unrelated things, yet she kept the bottle close to her side. When she was done, she put the organizer on the counter and slipped the bottle back into the cabinet. That night, I counted the pills. 3 were missing. I began writing down the number each morning, a small mark on a notepad I kept in the drawer. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern was clear. Pills went missing only after their visits. The realization made my stomach turn. I had no proof beyond my own notes, and I knew if I confronted them without something solid, it would turn against me. Still, I could not shake the thought that this was more than just carelessness or even control. It felt deliberate, like a slow erosion of my independence. If they could convince others that I was forgetful, that I could not manage my own medication. It would be a small step to say I could not manage my home or my finances. One morning, after another count came up short, I stood in the kitchen and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The sunlight through the window felt colder, the familiar space carrying an edge of intrusion. My home was still here, but my sense of safety was slipping away. I decided then that I needed to pay closer attention, to notice every detail, every shift in their words or actions. Whatever was happening was not just about the pills. It was about something larger, something I had not yet fully uncovered, but I could feel it pressing closer with each passing day. It was late January when Gregory called and said he wanted to take me out for lunch. His tone was warm, almost cheerful, as if we had not had those uneasy moments about my medication. I agreed because part of me still wanted to believe that things could return to how they once were. He arrived right on time, helped me with my coat, and said we had one quick stop to make before eating. We drove into the downtown area, and he parked in front of a low brick building with a polished brass plaque near the door. The lettering read, "Jenkins and Moore, Attorneys at Law." Gregory said it would take only a few minutes, just a bit of routine paperwork for his business. I hesitated, but he was already opening my door and gesturing for me to follow. Inside, the office smelled faintly of leather and coffee. A woman at the reception desk greeted us, and Gregory told her we had an appointment. She handed me a clipboard with a few forms, smiling in a way that seemed meant to be reassuring. I asked quietly if this had anything to do with me, and Gregory said it was just some insurance updates that needed my signature as a precaution. We were led into a small conference room. A man in a navy suit introduced himself as Mr. Jenkins. He slid a stack of papers toward me, along with a pen that felt heavier than it should have. He spoke in calm, measured tones, pointing out where I needed to sign. Gregory sat beside me, leaning just close enough that I could feel the pressure of his presence. I glanced at the first page. The print was dense, the legal language twisting into long sentences I would have had to read twice to understand fully. Gregory told me not to worry about the details, that it was standard language for property protection. The words sounded harmless enough, and the way he said them made it seem like there was nothing to question. I turned the pages slowly, but the lawyer moved his hand along the margins, showing me where to start. There was no time to read in full. My name appeared in several places, each next to a blank line. I signed where they told me to, the ink smooth and dark against the paper. Part of me wanted to stop and ask for a copy to review, but another part, the part that had trusted Gregory all his life, kept moving the pen along. When it was over, Mr. Jenkins gathered the papers neatly and placed them in a folder. Gregory thanked him, and we walked back out into the cold afternoon. My stomach was unsettled, but I told myself it was nothing. We went to a small bistro a few blocks away, and Gregory kept the conversation light. He asked about the roses in the front yard, about the book I was reading, never once mentioning the documents again. That evening, I sat in my chair by the bay window, watching the shadows stretch across the street. Something about the day clung to me. I could not recall a single line of what I had signed, only the way Gregory's voice had been steady and certain, the way Mr. Jenkins had kept the pace moving. I tried to convince myself it was as simple as they said, but the unease would not leave. Over the next week, I noticed small changes. Gregory stopped asking about the house repairs I had planned. Vanessa began talking more openly about what the place could sell for, as if it were a hypothetical she enjoyed exploring. They both seemed lighter in their manner, and yet I felt an invisible thread tightening around me. One afternoon, I went to the kitchen desk where I kept important mail and found an envelope addressed to Gregory but sent to my home. The return address was from the law office. I placed it back exactly as I found it, my hands cold. It felt like stepping into a room where someone had been talking about you just before you entered. A few days later, Vanessa stopped by while Gregory was away. She walked through the house slowly, commenting on how some of the furniture might not fit in a smaller place. When I asked why she thought I would be moving, she smiled and said she had a feeling it would be better for everyone. There was no malice in her tone, only a calm certainty that left me uneasy. That night, I lay in bed replaying the scene at the lawyer's office. The way the papers had been thick in my hands, the way I had signed without reading, the way they had moved so quickly to gather them up. The thought that I had agreed to something far larger than an insurance update began to take root. Still, I said nothing. I told myself there must be a reasonable explanation, that Gregory would never trick me into signing something that would harm me. But the doubt had already begun to settle in my bones. It sat there quietly, waiting for the moment it would be proven right. It was a Thursday morning when the knock came, sharp and fast against the front door. I was in the kitchen, halfway through my coffee, when I heard Gregory's voice calling my name. I walked to the door, expecting him to be alone, but Vanessa stood beside him with her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the entryway as though she were already taking inventory. Behind them, parked at the curb, was a large moving truck idling with its engine rumbling. Gregory said they had made a decision. His tone was steady, but there was no room for discussion in it. He told me it was no longer safe for me to live alone, that the house was too much for me to manage, and that they had arranged for me to stay somewhere more suitable. I asked what he meant by arranged, and he explained that the moving crew was here to pack my belongings. The words landed heavily, almost too heavy to process in the moment. Vanessa stepped forward, holding a folder. She said it was all in order, that the paperwork I had signed weeks ago had made the transition easier. I remembered the afternoon at the lawyer's office, the pages I had not read, the steady hand guiding me from one signature to the next. My chest tightened as I realized what they had prepared for. The movers began filing into the house, carrying empty boxes, their boots leaving faint tracks on the hardwood floors I had polished for decades. I tried to tell Gregory I needed more time, but he shook his head and said everything was already set. His voice was gentle, almost rehearsed, but behind it I could hear the finality. I walked from room to room in a daze, watching strangers handle the things that had filled my life. The family photographs, the quilt my mother had made, the books I had collected over the years, all being wrapped and stacked without a word about where they would go. Vanessa followed me closely, speaking in that same calm tone, saying it would be a fresh start, that I would thank them later. By midday, the kitchen counters were bare, the pantry emptied. I stood in the doorway of the library room, my hands resting on the frame, as the movers packed the last of my books. The sound of tape sealing the boxes was sharp, final. I could feel the edges of my life being folded shut one by one. When they carried out the last box, Gregory came to me with a set of keys in his hand. He said they would be changing the locks that afternoon, that it was for my safety. I looked at the keys I had held for over 40 years and realized they no longer meant what they once had. They drove me to a small furnished apartment on the edge of town. It was clean and tidy, but it felt like a place meant for passing through, not for living. Vanessa walked through it briskly, pointing out where I could put my things, while Gregory set the boxes in the corner. They stayed only long enough to make sure I was settled, then left, taking the moving truck with them. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in from every side. I sat on the small sofa, my coat still on, and tried to piece together how quickly it had all happened. From the missing medication to the lawyer's office to the morning's eviction. The steps were so precise, so coordinated, that I wondered how long they had been planning it. That night, I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the movers carrying away the parts of my life and heard the sound of the front door closing behind me. I thought about the roses in the front yard, the bay window that caught the afternoon light, The worn spot on the kitchen counter where Robert used to lean while talking to me. Those were mine. And yet, now, they belonged to someone else in name and in control. Over the next few days, I tried to make the apartment feel familiar, but the walls were bare, the rooms impersonal. Gregory called once to ask if I was comfortable, his voice light, almost casual. Vanessa did not call at all. I knew they believed they had done what was best, or at least that was the story they would tell if anyone asked. Still, in the quiet of that small space, I felt the truth settling in. They had not moved me out of concern. They had moved me because it cleared the way for something else, something that had to do with the papers I had signed and the value of the house I no longer lived in. The thought sat in my mind like a stone, immovable and cold. By the end of the week, I found myself walking a few blocks to a small park, just to be around something alive and open. I sat on a bench, watching the bare branches sway in the wind, and tried to imagine what my next step could be. I had no plan yet, only the certainty that I could not let this be the final chapter of my life. The apartment was a place to sleep, nothing more. My real home was gone, but my sense of what had been taken from me was sharper than ever. I began to think about the small details I had overlooked, the conversations that had seemed harmless at the time. Each one was a thread, and if I could pull at them long enough, perhaps I could see the whole pattern. For now, I waited, I listened, and I let the quiet work on me, turning my grief into something steadier, something that could hold. 3 days after the eviction, the silence in the apartment began to feel like it was pressing in from every wall. The air seemed colder than it should have been, and no amount of turning the heater up could change it. I had unpacked only what I needed, leaving the rest of the boxes stacked in the corner like reminders of a life I no longer lived. The stillness was heavy, but it also gave me time to think. Too much time, perhaps. On the 4th morning, I decided to walk farther than the park. My feet carried me along the streets I used to drive without thinking, past the bakery with the faded green awning, past the little hardware store where Robert had once bought a brass hook for the porch swing. The familiarity of it all was both comforting and sharp, like running my hand over fabric that caught on my skin. When I turned onto Maple Lane, I saw Ruth's house at the end of the block. Her place had always looked warm, with its wide porch and flower beds that even in winter held dried stalks tied neatly with twine. I had not spoken to her in months, not since the day Gregory had insisted on driving me straight home after Sunday service. It was as though he did not want me to linger with anyone too long. I stood at the edge of her walkway for a moment before stepping up. When she opened the door, the scent of cinnamon and coffee drifted out, and she smiled in that unhurried way she always had. Her eyes scanned my face, and I could see her reading more than I said when I told her I had been staying in a new apartment. She invited me in without asking for details, guiding me toward the kitchen table where a pot of coffee sat between 2 mugs. We talked about the weather first, about how the frost had come earlier than expected this year. Then, slowly, she let the conversation bend toward me, asking how I was finding the new place. I told her it was fine, though the word felt thin in my mouth. She nodded, but didn't push. Instead, she slid a plate of warm scones toward me, waiting in that way that left room for truth to rise on its own. It was there, at Ruth's kitchen table, that the weight of what had happened began to loosen just enough for words to come. I told her about the movers, the keys, the papers I had signed without understanding. Her face remained calm, but I saw the small tightening at the corners of her mouth. She asked me to go back, step by step, through the last month, and as I spoke, I began to see the pattern more clearly. Ruth had known Gregory since he was a boy. She remembered when Robert and I bought the house, remembered the summer evenings when the whole neighborhood would gather on our porch. She also knew Vanessa, though not well, and she said gently that sometimes people's intentions were not as clean as their words. I could tell she was choosing her language carefully, offering me space to hear my own story without forcing her judgment on it. After we finished our coffee, she showed me the spare room she kept for her granddaughter when she visited from college. The bed was neatly made, the dresser empty, as though it were waiting for someone to arrive. She said it would be no trouble if I wanted to stay a few nights, that it might be easier than staring at unopened boxes. I hesitated, feeling the pull between pride and the comfort of company. In the end, I said yes, telling myself it was only temporary. That evening, I carried a small suitcase from the apartment to her house, feeling lighter with each step. The apartment keys stayed in my coat pocket, but I did not think about going back right away. Living in Ruth's house was like stepping into a different rhythm. In the mornings, we drank coffee at the same table where I had first told her my story. In the afternoons, she tended to her plants or read on the porch while I helped prepare dinner. There was no hovering, no unspoken tension, only the quiet presence of someone who was not waiting for me to leave. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Ruth came in holding a small folder. She said she had kept some information from a workshop she attended on protecting property and financial rights, thinking it might be useful someday. Inside were notes about legal aid clinics, elder advocacy groups, and steps to request copies of property deeds. She suggested I look through them when I felt ready. That night, lying in the spare room, I read every page. The language was dry, full of terms I barely understood. But it planted something in me. I began to wonder what the papers I had signed really said, whether they could be challenged, whether my name was still somewhere in the chain of ownership. The thought was fragile but steady, like the first light of morning pressing against the edges of night. By the end of the week, Ruth and I had fallen into an easy pattern. I helped her with small tasks, and in return, she gave me the space to think without rushing me toward an answer. But beneath the calm, my mind was turning over each detail of the last month, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across the floor. One afternoon, I decided to walk past my old street. I stood across from the house, watching the curtains shift in the living room window. A new car sat in the driveway, and for a moment, I wondered if it was already theirs in every way that mattered. The sight was sharp, but instead of crumbling, I felt a thin thread of resolve pulling through me. Back at Ruth's, I sat at the kitchen table and began making a list, not of things I had lost, but of steps I could take. People to call, papers to request, questions to ask quietly. I did not yet know how far this would go, but for the first time since that morning at the front door, I felt as though I had more than just grief in my hands. The morning light at Ruth's kitchen window was soft, spilling across the table where my notes from the night before still lay scattered. A week had passed since I first arrived, and each day I found myself looking at those pages longer, adding small details I had not noticed before. Dates, signatures, the odd timing of certain conversations with Gregory and Vanessa. What had once felt like a blur was starting to take shape. And it was not a shape I trusted. I began with the property records. Using one of the phone numbers Ruth had given me, I called the county clerk's office and asked for information on the deed for my house. The woman on the line was polite, explaining the process for requesting copies. She said it could be mailed or picked up in person, and I chose to make the trip myself. It felt important to hold the papers in my hands. The clerk's office was in the old municipal building downtown, the kind with marble floors and high windows that let in more light than warmth. I waited in line behind a man paying property taxes, my hands tucked into my coat pockets, heart beating faster than it should have. When it was my turn, I slid the request form across the counter and watched the clerk disappear into a back room. When she returned, she handed me a thin stack of papers stapled at the corner. I thanked her, but I did not open them until I was sitting on a bench outside. The first page showed the familiar address, but below that, the owner's name was no longer mine. The transfer date was 2 weeks before Gregory had told me they needed to finalize some paperwork for insurance purposes. My name had been replaced entirely, not even listed as a co-owner. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, but the memory of signing anything like this was gone. I stared at the lines of ink, the notary stamp, the official seal pressed into the paper. Something in my chest went cold. It was not just the house. If they had been able to change this without me fully understanding, what else had been moved or signed away? Back at Ruth's, I spread the papers out on the table. She stood beside me, reading each page slowly, her brow furrowed. She pointed to a line where the witness signature belonged, a name I didn't recognize. That, she said, might be worth asking about. Over the next 2 days, I went through my old files, which I had brought from the apartment in 2 battered boxes. Bank statements, insurance forms, old letters from Robert's lawyer. I began to see gaps in the timeline. Large sums transferred out of an account I thought was still mine. Insurance beneficiaries updated months before the eviction. Each piece felt like a thread leading to something bigger, though I could not yet see the full pattern. One afternoon, Ruth drove me to the small bank branch where Gregory had once insisted I open a joint account for convenience. The manager there was a woman I remembered from years back. Though her hair was shorter now and her glasses sat lower on her nose, she greeted me kindly, but when I asked for records of recent transactions, her expression shifted. She said she would need written authorization from the other account holder. My name alone was no longer enough. That night, lying in the spare room, I replayed the moment in my mind. The way Gregory had pushed for that joint account, how Vanessa had been the one to drive me there. At the time, it had seemed harmless, even helpful. Now, it looked like another stone in a path they had been laying for years. The next morning, I decided to visit the neighborhood where my house stood. Ruth came with me, and we parked far enough away that we could walk without drawing attention. The curtains were closed, but the front porch light was on, though it was broad daylight. I noticed small changes. A new lock on the gate, the porch swing gone, the welcome mat replaced. It no longer looked like my home. On the way back, we stopped at a small cafe. Over coffee, I told Ruth that I was starting to think this was more than a family misunderstanding. The papers, the account changes, the timing, it all pointed to a plan. Not one made in haste, but one built piece by piece, waiting for the moment I would be most vulnerable. Ruth reached across the table, resting her hand over mine for a moment before saying I needed to protect myself before confronting anyone. She reminded me that people who can take this much without guilt will not hesitate to take more if given the chance. Her words settled deep, both a warning and a kind of permission to keep digging. That evening, I wrote down a new list, not just of what I needed to find, but of the people who might help me. The lawyer who had handled Robert's estate, the notary whose name was on the deed transfer, even the neighbor who had seen the movers that morning. I was not ready to confront Gregory or Vanessa yet, but for the first time, I knew exactly where I needed to start. 2 days after finding the deed transfer, I decided it was time to speak to someone who had been close enough to see what happened, but far enough to be honest. The name that kept coming back to me was Margaret Brooks, the neighbor who had lived next door for over 30 years. She had always been quick to bring over a plate of cookies during the holidays, and she knew more about the comings and goings on our street than anyone else. I called her from Ruth's kitchen that morning. Her voice on the other end was warm but careful, as if she sensed that this was not a casual call. We agreed to meet at the library cafe, a place quiet enough that no one would overhear us. Margaret arrived in a pale blue coat and carried the same leather purse she had owned for years. She sat across from me, ordered a cup of tea, and waited for me to begin. I told her I was trying to understand the events of that morning when Gregory and Vanessa had the movers at my house. She hesitated before speaking, glancing at the people around us as if checking for familiar faces. Then she told me she had seen the moving truck parked in front of my house just after sunrise, and that Vanessa had been there, directing the movers before Gregory even arrived. She described how they carried out boxes marked with labels I recognized as my own handwriting: jewelry, documents, family albums, items I had never packed or agreed to move. She remembered seeing one of the movers carry out the cedar chest Robert had made for me on our 10th anniversary. It was heavy, and she had been surprised when Vanessa told him to take it to the truck instead of leaving it by the door as he first intended. Her words sank into me like stones. I had assumed the movers were there for my larger furniture, but to know that personal items, pieces of my life, had been taken without my knowledge made my hands tremble under the table. I thanked Margaret for telling me and promised I would not involve her name in anything unless it became absolutely necessary. Later that afternoon, I went to the law office that had handled Robert's estate years earlier. The attorney, Mr. Callahan, still had the same office on Main Street, though the waiting room had been updated. When he saw me, his expression was one of polite surprise, but as soon as we sat down, he grew serious. I told him about the deed transfer, the missing items, and the account restrictions. He listened without interrupting, then reached for a folder on his desk. Inside was a copy of Robert's original will, along with notes from the meetings we had attended together. He reminded me that the house had been left entirely in my name, free of debt, and that any change to that status would have required my explicit, informed consent. He said he would request official copies of the transfer filings and compare them to the signatures they had on file. If there were discrepancies, he would refer me to a specialist in contested property claims. When I left his office, I felt both heavier and more focused. The threads I had been gathering were starting to weave into something I could not ignore. This was not a misunderstanding born of stress or miscommunication. This was deliberate. The following morning, I saw Vanessa for the first time since the eviction. I had gone to the grocery store early to avoid the weekend crowds, and she walked in wearing a tailored coat and a scarf wound tightly around her neck. She noticed me almost immediately, her lips curling into something that might have been called a smile if it had reached her eyes. We passed in the produce section. She stopped, adjusting the scarf with a sharp tug, and remarked that she hoped I was settling in, wherever I was now. Her tone was polite enough for anyone listening, but beneath it was a current I recognized, a quiet assertion of control. I replied with nothing more than a nod, forcing my face to remain still, my voice calm. Inside, though, my thoughts were already moving ahead, wondering how much she knew of my efforts and whether she suspected I was gathering the kind of proof that could undo her work. When I returned to Ruth's, I placed the grocery bags on the counter and sat down to write everything in my notebook. Dates, locations, names, exact words. I did not want to rely on memory alone, because I knew there might come a time when I would have to recall them with precision. Each page felt like a small anchor against the tide they had tried to pull me under. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in weeks, not because the problem was solved, but because I had taken another step toward facing it directly. There was no turning back now. The day after my meeting with Margaret and the tense encounter with Vanessa, I returned to Mr. Callahan's office. His secretary greeted me with a cautious smile, as if she had been told not to speak too much. When I stepped into his office, he already had a thin folder set on the desk. The moment he opened it, I could see copies of the documents I had been waiting for. He slid one page toward me and pointed to the signature line. My name was there, but it was wrong. The letters had my shape, but the flow was stiff, the pressure uneven. It was the kind of forgery that might fool someone glancing quickly, but not someone who had been signing the same name for over 70 years. Mr. Callahan confirmed my suspicion, saying the notary listed was one he had never worked with and whose license had been suspended months before the transfer date. There was more. He had pulled the bank transaction history for the account Robert and I had once shared. Several withdrawals had been made in the weeks leading up to my eviction, each one in amounts just under the reporting threshold, the kind of pattern designed to avoid scrutiny. The totals were staggering. I felt the room shift slightly as I realized that this was not only about the house. Gregory and Vanessa had been draining assets quietly, likely planning for a moment when they could take everything without me being able to respond. Mr. Callahan recommended contacting a forensic document examiner and a financial investigator. He said he would arrange the first appointment and would reach out to a colleague who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. The term sat heavy in my mind, both sharp and humiliating, but I knew it was the truth. This was not an unfortunate family disagreement. This was calculated theft. By the time I left his office, the air outside felt colder, though the sun was still shining. I walked slowly back to Ruth's, holding the folder close to my chest. Each page inside was another piece of the wall I was building against them. That evening, while Ruth prepared dinner, I sat at her kitchen table and organized the documents into separate piles: property transfer, bank statements, witness accounts. I added my handwritten notes, stapling them to the corresponding pages so nothing would get lost. It felt almost ceremonial, as if each stack represented a step toward reclaiming my life. 2 days later, I met with the document examiner, a woman named Ellen Ward. Her office was lined with framed certificates and photographs from court cases she had testified in. She took the transfer document in her gloved hands, studying it under a bright lamp. She explained the differences in stroke patterns, pressure, and rhythm between a genuine signature and a forged one. Then she pulled out the signature card from my bank, placing it beside the deed. The contrast was undeniable. She told me her report would be ready within a week, and that she would stand by her findings in any legal setting. While I felt a flicker of relief, it did not last long. The following afternoon, Gregory appeared at Ruth's doorstep. He did not come inside, and his tone was strangely casual. But there was a warning in his words. He said he had heard I was digging around, and that it would be a shame if things became more difficult than they needed to be. I kept my expression neutral, my hands steady, and told him only that I was doing what I needed to do. After he left, Ruth found me in the living room staring at the folder of documents. She did not ask what had been said, only set a cup of tea on the table and told me that sometimes the quietest path was still the strongest. I understood her meaning. Gregory wanted me to react in anger, to make mistakes he could use against me. Instead, I would let the evidence grow until it was undeniable. That night, I placed the folder in a locked box Ruth had kept from her days as a school principal. I slid it under the bed in the guest room where I slept, the key resting in the drawer beside my lamp. Knowing it was there, hidden and safe, gave me a measure of comfort I had not felt since the day they pushed me out of my own home. The next steps were clear. I would gather the rest of the proof, prepare for legal action, and keep my movements measured. Gregory and Vanessa believed they had already won, but they had underestimated how far I was willing to go to reclaim what was mine. The morning after Ellen Ward called to confirm her final report was ready, I woke to the sound of Ruth on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was low, controlled, but the tension in it told me something was wrong. When she hung up, she came to the doorway of my room, holding the cordless phone in her hand. Someone from the county tax office had called. They had received a notice from Gregory's lawyer, claiming the property taxes on my former home were now in dispute because of an alleged debt I had left unpaid. It was a lie, and we both knew it. I had paid those taxes on time for decades, never missing a deadline. This was not about money. This was about creating chaos, painting me as irresponsible, and using the legal system as another weapon. I dressed quickly and went straight to Mr. Callahan's office. He listened without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. He told me this was a common tactic in cases like mine. They were trying to overwhelm me, to bury me in paperwork and hearings until I either gave up or made a costly mistake. He reminded me that with Ellen's report, the forged deed was now a documented fact, but that we still needed to be strategic. By afternoon, it became clear that Gregory and Vanessa were moving faster than I had expected. A letter arrived at Ruth's, addressed to me but written on the stationery of a debt collection agency. It claimed I owed nearly $40,000 for repairs and improvements made to the house in the months after I had been removed. The list included fabricated charges, an entire kitchen remodel, landscaping services, roof work. None of it was real, but on paper it looked official. Ruth sat across from me at the table, reading the letter twice before setting it down. She told me not to let it shake me. Still, I could see the weight of it in her eyes. I knew she feared this was only the beginning, and she was right. 2 days later, Margaret called from the cafe. She had overheard Vanessa speaking to another woman about my mental decline, claiming I had been mismanaging money for years and that the family had no choice but to step in. Margaret's voice trembled with anger as she recounted the conversation. The smear campaign had started, and it was spreading into the community. I thanked her, though my stomach turned as I realized how deliberate this all was. They wanted to destroy my credibility before the case could reach court. Without trust, even the truth could be made to look like a lie. That night, I took out the locked box and reviewed every document again. I added Ellen's formal report to the stack, tucking it between the property records and the bank statements. The neat order of the pages was the only thing keeping me steady. The next morning, Mr. Callahan called with a suggestion. He believed it was time to file a formal injunction to prevent the sale or transfer of the property until the forgery case was resolved. It would not return me to the house immediately, but it would freeze their ability to profit from it. He warned that once we filed, Gregory and Vanessa would escalate. I told him I was ready. The paperwork went in the same day. By evening, I received a series of calls from numbers I did not recognize. I did not answer, but each voicemail was the same. Short, mocking comments from voices I knew belonged to Gregory's circle. They spoke as if the outcome was already decided, as if I was an old woman grasping at something long gone. I did not delete them. I saved every one. Later, as Ruth and I sat in the living room, she asked if I regretted starting this fight. I told her no. Regret belonged to people who had chosen silence. I had been silent once, and it had cost me everything. Now, even if I lost the house, I would not lose my voice again. Outside, the street was quiet, but I could feel the pressure building. Gregory and Vanessa were not finished. They were testing the limits of how far they could push before I broke. What they did not understand was that they had already pushed too far, and the line they thought I would never cross was behind me now. The day of the injunction hearing arrived gray and cold, the kind of morning that seeped into the bones. Ruth drove me to the courthouse, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her jaw set. I could feel her determination beside me, and I drew on it as we climbed the stone steps together. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and paper. The benches were polished smooth from years of use. Gregory sat at the front with Vanessa, their attorney between them. They looked composed, dressed in muted tones that were meant to project calm authority. I knew better. Their stillness was the mask of people who believed their version of events was untouchable. Mr. Callahan greeted me quietly, placing a steadying hand on my arm. He had already reviewed Ellen's report with the judge's clerk and submitted every supporting document. Today's hearing was not about deciding full ownership of the house. It was about whether Gregory and Vanessa would be allowed to sell or transfer it before the case could be heard in full. The judge entered, and the room shifted into silence. Gregory's attorney spoke first, his voice smooth as he painted a picture of a concerned son and daughter-in-law forced to step in to protect family assets from what he called my erratic management. He cited the fabricated debts, the supposed renovations, and the property taxes. Each statement landed like a stone in the quiet air. When it was Mr. Callahan's turn, he rose with the calm precision of a man who knew his footing. He laid out the timeline, each date aligning with the paper trail in front of him. He presented Ellen's analysis of the signatures, highlighting the inconsistencies and the undeniable signs of forgery. He submitted bank records proving the taxes had been paid and receipts for the maintenance I had handled myself. At one point, he paused, lifting a photograph from the file. It was the front of the house as it had been before I left, its porch lined with the same flowers I had planted each spring. He held it up alongside a recent photograph, showing the property unchanged. No remodel, no new landscaping, no roof work. The silence that followed was heavy. Gregory's attorney attempted to discredit Ellen's credentials, but the judge stopped him with a single raised hand. She noted that Ellen's standing as a court-recognized handwriting expert had been established in prior cases. The challenge faded quickly after that. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was even but decisive. She granted the injunction, ordering that the property remain frozen until the forgery and ownership claims could be resolved. Gregory and Vanessa would not be able to sell, rent, or alter the house in any significant way. It was not a full victory, but it was a foothold. As we left the courtroom, I felt a shift inside me. For the first time since that day, they had forced me out. There was a ruling in my favor, something tangible that stood against them. It was not the end, but it was proof that the truth could hold its ground. Outside, the winter air cut sharp against my face, but I welcomed it. Ruth linked her arm through mine, and we walked to the car without looking back. In the rearview mirror, I caught sight of Vanessa watching us from the courthouse steps, her expression tight. She knew this was a setback, and she would not let it go unanswered. That evening, Mr. Callahan called to say that while today's ruling was important, we needed to be ready for their next move. He had no doubt they would attempt to pressure witnesses, twist community opinion, or introduce new claims. The case was still months from trial. I hung up and sat in the quiet living room, the file box beside me. Every page in it told a story. Dates, receipts, statements, photographs, all pieces of my life that I had once taken for granted. They were no longer just records. They were my defense, my history, my proof. I thought of the years in that house, of the mornings I had stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the light move across the garden. I thought of the sound of the floorboards under my feet, the familiar creak in the hallway, the way the sun warmed the front steps in late afternoon. They were not just memories. They were the threads of a life I had built, and I would not let them be erased. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I felt the ground under me begin to steady. Spring arrived with a hesitant warmth, the kind that lingered only in the afternoons before retreating into cool evenings. Months had passed since the injunction, and in that time, the legal process had wound its slow and deliberate course. Every week brought new filings, new statements from Gregory's side, each one more desperate than the last. But the more they pushed, the more their inconsistencies showed. The trial was set for late April. On the morning it began, I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the navy skirt suit Ruth had insisted I wear. It had belonged to her mother, and she told me it carried the kind of quiet dignity that didn't need explanation. I walked into the courthouse with my head high, my steps measured, feeling the weight of every moment that had led to this one. The courtroom was more crowded than before. Neighbors had come, curious to see the dispute that had whispered through the community for months. Some sat stiffly, unsure whose side to believe. Others offered small nods when our eyes met, silent signals that they were here for me. The proceedings unfolded over 2 days. Gregory's attorney clung to the narrative that I had been unable to manage my affairs, that they had stepped in out of necessity. But each claim cracked under the pressure of evidence. Ellen's testimony was precise and unshakable, her explanation of the forged signatures leaving no room for doubt. Mr. Callahan walked the judge through each document, connecting them like links in a chain until the full picture stood clear. Gregory took the stand reluctantly. His voice faltered when asked to explain why property tax receipts bore my original signature in years when he claimed I had neglected payment. Vanessa's testimony was sharper, but even she stumbled when confronted with photographs and contractor statements disproving the supposed renovations. On the final afternoon, the judge read her ruling. The deed transfer was declared null and void. The property was restored to my sole ownership. Gregory and Vanessa were ordered to vacate within 14 days and to cover my legal fees in full. The decision was delivered in the same measured tone as any other case, but for me, it landed like the opening of a locked door. I sat still for a moment, letting it sink in. Then Ruth reached over, taking my hand in hers, and I felt the steady beat of my own heart answering back. When we walked out into the sunlight, it was warmer than it had been in months. The air felt open. The sky stretched wide above the courthouse steps. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the house. It was quiet when I stepped inside, as if it had been holding its breath. Dust had gathered in the corners, and the scent of stale air clung to the rooms, but it was still mine. My photographs were gone, my books boxed away somewhere, but the walls were the same. The garden still waited outside for my hands. I began cleaning slowly, room by room. With each surface cleared, each window opened, it felt as if I was reclaiming more than just a space. I was taking back the years of my life they had tried to overwrite. Gregory never came to speak to me. There were no apologies, no explanations. I heard from neighbors that they had moved to another state within weeks. Part of me grieved for the son I had once known, the boy who had run through this house barefoot, laughing. But the part of me that had endured these past months understood that some losses, while painful, are necessary to survive. I planted new flowers along the front porch that spring. As I worked the soil, the scent of fresh earth and the sound of birdsong surrounded me. It was not a return to what had been before, but the start of something steady, something I could stand on without fear of it being pulled from under me again. I had once been quiet because I thought it was safer. Now, I know the cost of that silence. I would never let someone else write the story of my life for me again. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.